Well, what do you guys think? I mean, you've been watching the show. Do you have any revelations that you realized while you were watching any of these talks so far? Anyone?
My field is addiction to processed foods, and I always appreciate this reinforcing data, research, stories about the miracle of keto food plans, low carb, carnivore, in terms of restoring health. And I always, I kind of feel sorry for the people who see this information. They've got it in front of them. It's very persuasively presented, but here's this invisible barrier of the addiction. And they want it. They've been told they should be able to get it, and their cravings win over and over again. So there's this kind of unrecognized, undiagnosed, untreated. It's really, addictions are considered to be mental illnesses. And just how sad it is for both the practitioner, the educator, the researcher, knowing all these incredible benefits are on to be had if somebody can just follow a food plan. And then that person wanting it so badly, trying very, very hard, but losing against an invisible addiction. So that just comes to my mind over and over again when I see presentations on the value of what I call a clean, non-addictive food plan. That's what I've been thinking.
Okay, well, we're trying to get Georgia back. I'm just going to open up the floor. Anybody have any thoughts about what they've seen so far? Anyone else?
I don't have any questions, but I do also feel a great deal of appreciation for everyone coming together like this. I think there are a lot of components that go into the whole health picture on a ketogenic diet. Addiction can be a piece for some people. Just getting foods that are actually hitting satiety and not feeding into the whole glucose metabolism, which I think we don't necessarily appreciate the difference between a ketogenic metabolism and the glucose metabolism when we're just thinking about foods as as being low carb or not, because we ultimately, anything that we eat that has glucose in it is going to be used in that way.
Could I just ask a question? Is this being aired publicly anywhere, or do you have to actually register for the conference in order to see this?
Yeah, from what I understand, you have to be registered to see it live, and then 2 or 3 months from now, I believe it will go out on YouTube as public.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, there are a few questions here. Dave Feldman, Amber, has your own sleep gotten better since your recent research on the topic?
No, actually, the research on the topic was so all-consuming that it was actually preventing me from getting good sleep. I think that my sleep has, in general, since I started a ketogenic diet, improved. And like many people that I've talked to, I seem to be able to get rested on less sleep. But of course, I've had, my own journey, ups and downs from the time that I started a low carb diet to now, with many different stages of life going on. So there are a lot of things that go into sleep. I have never experienced the insomnia that I know some people have experienced with a ketogenic diet. And I've been very interested in trying to figure out what's behind that. It seems to me that for some people, sufficient energy could be a problem. So, for example, if you are eating a higher protein and lower fat diet, because for some people, not all, but for some people that seems to improve weight loss. The lack of the energy coming in as fat can actually contribute to getting less sleep. So there are dynamics like that people may want to pay attention to.
I think also we have found that screen use has a huge impact on sleep. That watching screens before you go to bed tends to just make the brain more active and more resistant to settling down into a sleep state. And it goes hand in glove with food.
Well, it's more than that because the light will shut down melatonin production, which you need to get to sleep. So it can not only disturb your sleep for that night, but it can start offsetting your whole circadian rhythm. So it's important to not get bright light right when you want to go to sleep and to get bright light when you want to wake up. Taking exogenous melatonin can help with that, but if you're also using bright light, then you're undoing what you're doing.
Yes. And sometimes when people haven't eaten enough throughout the day, cravings in an addicted brain, cravings will build up and they will be binging and watching television and binging because they're trying to, the food seeking brain has woken up. So that's it. There's an interface with food addiction and screen use late in the day, which I think has a big impact. And yes, so we're telling people also if they do wake up in the night, not to turn on a light, for the reasons that you're describing, Amber. Don't turn on a light. Just try to keep the light very, very low.
Eating too can disrupt.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Eating too can disrupt your circadian rhythms. So the energy system and the sleep system are all very tightly regulated together, which is one of the main things that I've been learning through studying sleep.
Yeah. And doesn't the circadian pathway regulate both sleep and eating? So if your sleep is disturbed, and we hear this, and I think this is a good explanation for it, that if people have had a bad night's sleep, they're more likely to lose control over their food the next day.
Well, yes, because if you have less sleep, it actually will make your appetite systems come into fuller force. So you will have lower leptin, higher ghrelin, for example, and you will want to eat more.
Yeah. Very interesting integration there.
Okay, we have some questions from YouTube. This one is for Nick. Nick, what data or research do we have on APE4 populations who are more likely healthy in diet and lifestyle?
Can you guys actually hear me? I've been trying to speak for a while.
Yes,
we can hear you now.
Okay, thanks. I would have loved to jump in. That was a very interesting discussion about circadian rhythms. I've been reading about that recently since there's been some interesting data on that, so we can maybe pop back over to that. But as for what was Dave's question, specifically about ApoE4s and what?
Yeah, it's what data or research do we have on APE4 populations who are more likely healthy in diet and lifestyle?
By that, I gather, since I know Dave, he doesn't mean that ApoE4s are more likely to be healthy, but that I think what he's kind of going for is a leading question for me. That so just for background, ApoE4 is the leading genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. It's the topic on which I'm going to speak tomorrow. So everything I'm going to say now is more detailed tomorrow. But it increases Alzheimer's risk on a population level by 3 to 12-fold on a population level. But those data more or less have all the same limitations that we see in the data with respect to, say, cardiovascular disease, where it's generally an unhealthy population eating a mixed diet. So I think with a lot of the existing literature, it's not that there's a preponderance of evidence supporting that, say, a ketogenic diet can really protect against cardiovascular risk long-term or Alzheimer's risk long-term. It's largely theoretical. Rather, it's that there's an absence of evidence supporting that it's actually harmful. And we won't have long-term studies for a long time. This is only becoming popular. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the biological plausibility and the mechanisms a little bit tomorrow. Anyway, so I'll put a pin in it there. And I just wanted to jump back to what Joan and Amber were talking about with the microbiome and circadian rhythm, because I think that's another area that is just fascinating and exploding with the bidirectional relationships between light input and food input. It's not just like even disturbed sleep will mess up your microbiome, although it will. And I want to talk about, we have a chance, my favorite study on this called the jet lag study, or I call it the jet lag study. But it's bidirectional. We now know that there are microbial associated components like muramyl dipeptide or flagellin that can act on TLR5 or mimic serotonin to cause drowsiness. So it's bidirectional, and when you eat is really important in determining how that food is metabolized. If you have carbs at one time of day versus another time of day, there's a massive difference. And there are studies now showing that microbiome-mediated changes in metabolism will affect body composition, insulin sensitivity, stuff like that. And you can show that through doing like fecal microbiome transplants. So there's some really interesting data that I think is an exploding area. If people want to look up a good review, Lopez et al. Just came out with one in cell metabolism. But I'll be quiet for a minute. I was just monologuing a bit.
Well, that's great. There are many components that go into that circadian alignment and misalignment, and there are studies showing that if you are misaligned, your glucose responses will be different, your insulin responses will be different. And even there was a clever study, and I don't remember the name offhand, but they wondered if melatonin itself might be part of the messed up glucose response that people are having when they're eating later. And so they gave subjects melatonin, and it did indeed show a higher glucose and insulin response in the patients who are having melatonin in the day.
Yeah. I'm almost trying to see if I can just find a figure to pull up, but that jet lag study I was alluding to was literally what they did. And this is a fascinating demonstration. It's like you take an individual before a transatlantic flight, right after a transatlantic flight when they're jet lagged, and then later after they recover. And if you transplant their microbiomes, feces, from when they're jet lagged into non-abiotic mice, germ-free mice without their own microbiomes, independent of food intake. So the mice aren't eating more or anything. The mice that get the jet lag microbiomes will be fatter, which goes hand in hand with a lot of the population data we have on things like night shift work and frequent flying being strongly linked with metabolic disease, even beyond obesity. It's a strong risk factor. So I think broadly speaking, the way I think about it is like your circadian rhythm, it's entrained by called zeitgebers, the environmental inputs, and the main one for your master clock in your brain, your suprachiasmatic nucleus, is light. That's the main input, comes through your optic nerve. And that's kind of the top-down control. But then we also know that we are meta-organisms that are communal with our microbiome, which is housed from light. So what is their main zeitgeber, their main input? It's food. And in order for your entire meta-organism, your microbiome, and your own cells to work in harmony, those cues have to be linked up. So it's like two branches of an orchestra. They have to work together. And when they're out of sync, you get messed up metabolic homeostasis, and you can have, metabolic issues. Seems biologically
that's exactly
possible
right.
at the very least. So,
we've come to understand that food is a bigger zeitgeber than we previously used to think, and specifically, if you're restricting the time that you're eating to a small window, then when you time that food can be stronger than compared to light than we used to think that it was, and that's an interesting connection that you're making to the microbiome. That may be part of the input. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the papers right now. There was one Thias et al. 2014. If I can find it, I'll pull up some of the graphics, because the thing you just said was just so spot on. You can literally invert the patterns of how particular microbes in the gut fluctuate. So if you take a mouse and you feed it during a different time window, a particular microbe will be fluctuating like this, and the sine wave will just invert if you change when you're feeding that mouse. It's quite astonishing. And it's so much more complicated than that, because it's not only just how much something is flourishing, but where it is in the gut. There are biogeographical migrations over the course of the day. There's one paper showing a 10-fold variation over the course of the day in what's called the endothelial niche. So the one that's, the microbes that are sitting right on the gut lining and talking to your body. I call it the bacterial trampoline, because I like to imagine them like flowing in and out over the course of the day, this endothelial niche. But it's really astonishing to think about, this circadian rhythm stuff, because it's not just this ultraradian rhythms, which are multiple times a day, circadian daily, then there's monthly cycles, seasonal. You compound all of these on top of your whole meta-organism, and it's no wonder these things are a little bit complicated. I think it's super cool.
Here's another question from YouTube. How about, what do you guys think about statins, not for LDL, but for inflammation from RA? No symptoms at the moment, off Imurin, and type 2, no meds for a year, A1C 5.2.
I'm going to let someone else take that. I have an opinion, but I have to be careful about what I say. So I'll let somebody else lead, but then
I don't have to be careful, but I'm not really an expert. But one thing that I do know about LDL is that it's part of your immune system. So reducing LDL to solve inflammation could actually backfire.
Yeah, I don't think, I'm not aware of data showing that like LDL is inflammatory. Now, with respect to type 2 diabetes, we do know that it increases your risk for getting type 2 diabetes. Statins in general. So I don't really have an opinion on it for RA. I mean, could it increase, statins tend to increase nitric oxide. It can promote vasodilation. That could be a good thing. In fact, it's one of the mechanisms maybe by which statins operate, in addition to increasing LDL receptors in the liver. I definitely would not take it to prevent diabetes. That I would say. Now, with respect to the statin literature in general, and I'm going to try to be as reasonable sounding about this as possible, because I'm not a quote cholesterol denier. I'm not someone who believes that LDL is just a meaningless variable. But I think this is one of those areas where I think we have less evidence than a lot of people think we do. With respect to the maybe population at hand, we're talking to the hyper-responders who are low carb. Because a lot of them, and now I'm talking about specifically like lean mass hyper-responders, they're identified by a particular lipid triad of really high LDL, above 200 milligrams per deciliter in US units, and then HDLs that are quite high, above 80 milligrams per deciliter, and LDLs below 70. Triglycerides below 70. And what I want to point out is that lipid triad, that metabolic phenotype, is not characteristic of populations of individuals who have been previously studied. So when you're looking at the existing literature, again, in my opinion, as a non-cardiologist, PhD neuroscientist, so this isn't my area of expertise, a lot of our assumptions, the preponderance of evidence that people talk about, are being derived from either animal models, which have certain limitations in that some of them are genetically programmed to be, adversely respond to high fat diets, which are generally 45 to 60% fat anyway, or genetic conditions like FH, where people have mutations in LDL receptors, which is a defect in the feedback pathway and a congenital defect. So these people are born and they're going to just have high LDL, which is different than diet and lifestyle-induced increases in LDL in the absence of other metabolic problems, and then it becomes a pretty difficult calculus, in my opinion, on a patient-by-patient level. Because, again, I really want to qualify this as my opinion, and I feel like I'm going to get in trouble for saying any of this, but But, that pro list for the statin, if we don't have as strong data as maybe we think we do, then the pro list becomes a question mark. Now, what about the con list? Because somebody could argue, well, there's not evidence that, say, statins would cause, say, dementia, because that's what I'm more worried about. And in fact, there was an abstract that's gotten a lot of publicity showing that maybe they do. The paper hasn't been published, so I don't want to comment too much on it. But, let's even just say that there's not that there's evidence showing statins cause dementia, but that it's biologically plausible, and I think I can say that with some authority as a neuroscientist. And, that there's an absence of evidence showing that there isn't any risk. So then the pro list and the con list both become question marks, and it comes down to the individual's case, the patient one has in front of them, to kind of, determine, is this a greater benefit or a greater risk for me? And I think that's a really complicated question. In fact, I put out a tweet this morning about this topic, and some people said it's not complicated, just lower ApoB. And I get where they're coming from. That said, I can tell you it's never that simple. There are always levers to pull, but you can't always pull all of them in any given patient. You can't necessarily increase carbohydrates because someone needs therapeutic ketosis. Sometimes people don't tolerate fiber. Sometimes they don't tolerate the statin. Or maybe they're more worried about the risk of dementia because they're an ApoE4 homozygote and they have no family history of cardiovascular disease. There are so many variables, and so in monologuing, I don't want to give you a straightforward answer. That was my intention. My intention was to confuse you because I think this is a confusing topic that deserves more discussion on a patient-by-patient basis. And if somebody says that there is a clear answer, I will be skeptical.
Just to follow up,
I think it's worse than that.
The person who wrote that same comment, the follow-up is that my doctor said that statins smooth out blood vessels.
I'll let Amber respond. I think she was going to say something.
Well, I wasn't going to respond to that question. I was going to say that it's worried about not having, very much, information about the particular triad. Like, even if we look back at some of the data, some of the massive data that we already have, and find some people who happen to have the same kind of profile that a lean mass hyper-responder would have, I think it's worse than that, because if you want to draw conclusions from a data set about a particular person, you have to have some confidence that there are people like that person in the data set. And one thing that's making, I think, most of the data set not like the people who would be here and listening to this data is that they aren't on a low carb diet. So, you could take, for example, you've got a huge data set and it shows that every single person that showed up with high ketones in the blood was, in a very dangerous, bad health situation. Well, of course, if they're all on high carb diets and they have ketones in the blood, then that indicates a huge problem. But if your metabolism is that of somebody on a ketogenic diet, then all the interpretations are subject to revision. And so unless we have some kind of assurance that the population that we're drawing from has a metabolic state that is similar, I think all of the conclusions are now suspect.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't even say that there are, you said individuals like that in the data set. I would say the data set has to be made up of individuals like that. Because what you
that's what I'm saying, exactly.
Yeah. No. I'm reinforcing the point that it's like if you have a population and you show, actually, honestly, I think if we put statins in the drinking water, overall CVD mortality will go down. But does that mean you're actually improving outcomes for every individual person? No. Because what if, there's that tiny, right now it is on a population level, a small fraction of LMHR, that are adversely affected. If they are, you wouldn't see that. It would be a signal lost in the noise. And just kind of going to that other question about statins smoothing out artery walls, blood vessels, I don't know if that's accurate. That sounds like he's saying like they remove plaques. And if that were the case, then, let's just let heart disease develop and then toss a statin in if we see a CAC score go up.
Show me the science.
My understanding is it's more about lifetime exposure to risk. High, and this would be, the conventionally minded person saying it's about lifetime exposure to high LDL, to high ApoB specifically. ApoB particles are like LDL, Lp(a), but the particle count's more important. And again, this is the question mark where we don't know. It's like, I'm gonna say, I agree completely that ApoB particles and LDL are part of the causal pathway of atherosclerosis. I don't think anybody can say that's not the case. But
I don't think we have sufficient evidence for that.
That it's
but
part
go
of
on.
the causal pathway? Okay, fine. Well, let's play devil's advocate. Let's say that's true. What I'm saying is, what we don't know is we don't know it's sufficient. We don't know that in isolation of everything else, having high ApoB is sufficient in and of itself to cause cardiovascular disease. So I think, again, you might not agree with this entirely, Amber, but like playing devil's advocate then. Let's say that even LDL is necessary for cardiovascular disease. I personally do think it is. It doesn't mean that LDL alone is sufficient. And then what do you do with that if somebody has a high LDL? Because whatever levers you're pulling, there might be downsides. That's what I'm saying. And it is always more complicated. So if LDL... Well,
that's a bit like saying calcium is necessary. Like if plaques are made of calcium, like does that mean that having lifetime exposure to calcium is bad for heart disease? I mean,
well,
I get what you're saying about necessary.
I'm not saying that I know for sure LDL lowering is a goal. I'm actually trying to give an inch to just even make the caveats that we can make very strongly to kind of, let's just say, even titrate in doubt. But if I think there's this supposition. This is what I've been looking for. This is the data I've been looking for. LDL or ApoB is sufficient to cause cardiovascular disease. Sufficient. That's the data I want to see. And I've never been able to find it, and I've been looking, and I've been looking, and I've been looking. Like somebody says, go listen to this 9-hour podcast by Dr. Dominic Dayspring, and I think he's brilliant. Like, I'll listen to it, and I can't find it. And honestly, like, I'm a lean mass hyperresponder, and I've gone into the cardiologist office, including at Harvard, MGH, and there are ways to figure this out. Like what I kind of want to get done, and maybe we will get done, is can we find that having high LDL in somebody who's really metabolically healthy, if we do a PET scan for macrophage infiltration in those artery walls, is there macrophage infiltration? Because if there's not, that's really interesting. But
agreed.
That clinical trial hasn't been done. So those are the kind of data that I'm kind of thinking about. And then there's just so many other mechanisms. I read a paper the other day. Have you guys heard of trained immunity? It's coming out a little bit more, at least I've been reading more about it, or being exposed to it in metabolic health and cardiovascular disease, but trained immunity, this is actually quite relevant to COVID, is, you have these two branches of your immune system, the innate immune system, the general, like, we're just going to inflame things immune system, and then the adaptive, the one that generates receptors and antibodies against particular pathogens. So trained immunity, memory, sounds like adaptive. Sounds like we're going to make receptors, we're going to make antibodies. What it actually refers to is a epigenetic priming of the innate immune system. Innate immune memory, and this is really interesting because what it shows is that exposure to prior inflammatory insults, pathogens, but also sterile insults, including a Western diet, and this has been demonstrated, will engage in trained immunity and make your innate immune system more pro-inflammatory, and that's programmed into actually the stem cells in your bone marrow, even independent of serocytokine markers. And that memory kind of sticks around. Interestingly, it's mediated by NLRP3, and we know from the 2015 and 2020 studies what inhibits NLRP3 ketones. It's just a really interesting discussion, because there's so many different mechanisms, and the point I always try to make is that I think there's more unknowns than we appreciate, and so it makes me a little bit upset, and maybe this is personal just because of my own limitations as a patient in this population, that it just isn't so simple. I'm not being flippant about it. I'm not turning the other cheek. I'm not cholesterol denying by any means. I'm trying to be a good scientist and reject the nulls, and these are really, really difficult questions that deserve conversation. So that was a really good question, whoever asked it, and I think that was a really long answer.
Dave Feldman has a question for the quarterback. Dave. Dave, how common or uncommon are cholesterol hyperresponders in low-carb type 1 diabetics? Dave, you there?
Dave.
Dave appears to be frozen.
This is Dave to Dave.
This is a lot of freezing going on. I'm not sure where Georgia is.
The vMix is not working well. I had some trouble with it. I don't know about everybody else. I wish we used Zoom. But,
well, anyway, this is what we're using. Here's another question. Any thoughts on high LDL when type 1 diabetics on low-carb diets? My A1C is 5.1 on low-carb, but LDL has skyrocketed to 273.
Well, I think it comes back to the unanswered question that we've been talking about. We don't know that LDL by itself is a problem, but if you are getting benefits from a low-carb diet and the low-carb diet is causing your LDL to go higher, then you basically have two choices. You can try to find, several choices. You can try to find ways to lower your LDL that doesn't involve a low-carb diet. You can give up your low-carb diet, or you can decide that it's worth the risk and not that, settle into this discomfort of not knowing.
Yeah, that's difficult in type 1 diabetes, especially because, the glucose excursions matter as well. So an HbA1c of 5.1 doesn't necessarily tell you about the excursions or prior damage that was done to the vessel wall that might be pre-existing from an earlier time when blood sugar wasn't as well controlled. And if there are already perforations, for lack of a better term, then is LDL sufficient to drive atherosclerosis? That's a hard question. And I don't feel comfortable commenting further on an individual case without knowing more details. But I generally would agree with Amber.
There's a good discussion of this very issue in Rob Lustig's new book, Metabolical. I'm not qualified to recite it, but he's breaking these numbers down into subcategories, and that would be a good place to get an answer, a further answer.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's on my read list. I just finished. I don't know if any of you guys read Ravenous. Lustig and Sam Apple were talking about it recently, but that was the cancer sugar book. Really interesting. What other questions do we have?
Yeah, that's about it. Except for that question for Dave.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
What have you guys been reading? Everybody else on the panel are interested in thinking about? Any new studies pop out that are exciting you?
Yeah, just 3 books in a row. Hooked by Michael Moss about how the corporations are creating loss of control. And then Mark Bittman's Animal Vegetable Junk. So I have a deeper background in economics and political science, and Mark Bittman just makes the point that the powerful people have been exploiting less powerful people using food for recorded history for 9,000 years. So we do see the food industry corporations having been the Kraft, Nabisco, and General Foods having been taken over by the tobacco industries in the mid-1980s. And we see a lot of these diet-related diseases coming out from that time frame. Children's obesity rates going from 10 to 15%, all American obesity and overweight rates going from 45% to 70%. So it was very encouraging in one way, discouraging in another. We just see these powerful corporations spreading the loss of control, spreading, the delusion that these foods are enjoyable, they're fun, and everybody should have the right to choose them, even though choice has been taken away by the addiction. Even children, even addicted children should have the right to be kind of provoked into temptation by availability. So that was
a favor.
Our employers.
We'd like to think that integrity would act on a check to economic incentives, because I don't think people are out of their way to corrupt the youth, but it's just, it's misaligned incentives. And like you said, it's misperceptions about how harmful this is, or even just, and I want to run this by you as a food addiction expert, I would say sugar as a substance of abuse is quite unique in that it's not the giving into the addiction that is socially stigmatized, but the abstinence from the substance. So if you're smoking, you get, there's social stigma associated with smoking. People push you to stop. With sugar addiction, you're actually stigmatized if you abstain, and you're pushed to engage in it, which sets up a very weird dynamic with an addictive substance. I think Michael Moss even said in his book, or quoted somebody in the book, basically saying, look, sugar doesn't need to be as addictive as cocaine. It doesn't need to, because all the cues are there, all the social cues, all the environmental cues. It has the liberty of being, I guess.
Alcohol has a similar thing. I just want to say alcohol can be like that. In many circles, there's a lot of pressure, unless you're very forward about having a problem that you're addressing medically. People tend to say, oh, you can have just one, or you're frowned upon as being kind of a party pooper if you won't engage in alcohol.
Ridiculed or chastised. I remember,
or just thought of as not fun.
The early days of understanding how toxic cigarettes are. Somebody lit up next to me in a restaurant while I was eating, because the dividing line was just right there. And I asked them to stop smoking and just got a barrage of abuse. So we're, as cultures understand about the harms of addictive substances, we were just in the early stage of understanding that tobacco causes cancer, just in the early stage of the education programs. And that's where we are with processed foods. So addicted people are not always, I shouldn't say that, but they're going to tend to ridicule the people who are not using, because that addiction loves company. So, we, in our programs, we have to explicitly train for what do you say and how do you hold your ground, because you're absolutely right. That's, it's a brutal aspect. It's a traumatizing aspect of this particular addiction.
Hey, Carl here. I have a question for you guys, and you can come back to this, but I know in Denver, marijuana is legal, and guess what? It just became legal in Connecticut as of July 1st. It's going to be legal in Connecticut recreational. And so if you are somebody who is keto, but you like your alcohol and you're probably drinking too much alcohol and it's keeping you from staying in ketosis, is going to, ditching the alcohol for THC vape pens or marijuana or edibles or gummies, something that you recommend?
No, not at all. Just address the addiction. We have people coming into our programs with their primary is weight loss or one of these diet-related diseases, but they get in there and they realize that they have to fight the natural urge of an addicted brain to transfer the addiction to another substance. So great, you get off the sugars and the flours and the excessive salt that are all addictive, the gluten, and then the brain just says, but let's find another addiction. Let's transfer this over to marijuana or to nicotine or to alcohol. And you haven't made progress, because all of those substances are negatively impacting the brain. The addiction is pulling blood flow away from the frontal lobe, for example. So if you're going to deal with this from an addictive frame point, you have to watch and see where the addiction is heading. What is it trying to transfer to?
I do think that anything can become the object of kind of abusive behavior in that way. But I also think that some things are less harmful than others from a metabolic standpoint. And I think that, transferring your cravings to something that is less harmful may not be the end solution, but it can be very helpful. For example, a lot of people who are going on a ketogenic diet at the beginning might rely on artificial sweeteners, and we can debate whether artificial sweeteners actually are harmless. Many of them, there are questions about that, but they're not going to have the same effect, the known effect that we would see that sugar would have. And so I've seen a lot of people who have had this progression where they're able to transfer to something else that provides a substitute while they're dealing with what other aspects might be behind that. And so in terms of substituting marijuana for alcohol, there may be ways in which marijuana is less harmful. I think we need a lot more data, but alcohol is going to have a much more immediate, dramatic effect on your metabolism in ways that we know about, and ways that probably marijuana doesn't have. Some people argue it's even beneficial.
I think what you're saying is valuable. If you're in a program, that's going to keep you progressing. But if you're in a program that says, great, you're on artificial sweetener, great, done. No, you're just leaving that person in an addicted state with hyperactive reward center brain cells, which is kind of the core of an addiction. And you're just setting them up to relapse back onto the sugar. So I
agree with you there, Joan. Yeah.
Context.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. This is vicious because it's a particularly vicious addiction because there are so many different substances. And, I would say to a person who's addicted to sugar, I just had this incredible conversation once with a fairly famous person, someone who was famous enough to be called a big influencer. And this person said to me, well, this keto treat company sent me a box of 24 of these keto treats, and I sat down and I ate the whole box. And then they emailed me a couple of weeks later and said, how did you like those? And he said, I liked them too much. And they said, are you out of them? And he said, yes, I have eaten them all. He said, oh, we'll send you some more. He said, please do not do that. So you see, in every environment, you got Atkins, low carb. Well, then the Atkins bars, and then some food corporation bought Atkins. South Beach Diet starts out clean. And then, then all the manufacturing opportunities come up, and boom, a processed food manufacturer is buying them. So a lot of these products are just gateways for the processed food manufacturers to retain market. I have
to say that I think that's a lot harder on a carnivore diet because the choices of food are much less of the type that are easy to hook into those kinds of things. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we get some products coming out that would be more.
Okay, good. Well, meat, animal protein has never been shown to create that addictive response, but the fat on meats can activate the same pathways as marijuana. It's the cannabinoid pathways. So, if somebody is going over to a carnivore diet because, yes, I get to eat all the fat I want, they're going to be healthier for sure. But, I had a person say this to me the other day, and I just thought it was so true.
It's self-limiting. It's satiating.
Well,
you
unless
can't
you're
overeat
addicted to it. So this person said,
really hard
my goal,
food fats.
My goal is not a body shape. My goal is to stop the battle in my head. Am I going to eat this? Am I not going to eat this? I want this, but I don't want this, but I'm told I should eat it, but I can't eat, just the battle in the head. And that is what is missing from the general discourse about what to eat and whether it's the best thing for you. So like I have one of my close business colleagues, she had a catering business for 35 years, and her binge food was fatty meat. She would go in the back of the kitchen and just binge on fatty meat. Fatty meat would just cause her to lose loss of control. So she doesn't eat it. She actually, over the years, became a vegan and is much more stable. Wow. But, Amber, you've used this phrase a couple of times here. It depends on the individual. It depends on the individual.
I'm going to just put back on that a tiny bit, because I think that fatty meat, if you have a problem where you've got a voice in your head saying don't eat this, then I can see that is a problem. But there may be people, and I don't want to say that they don't exist, but I've yet to meet a person who, when they allow themselves to eat as much fatty meat as they want, over time, that does not settle down. And because fat and meat are satisfying your actual needs.
But there's
if you can get around that relationship by letting yourself have it.
No.
Because with sugar, you can eat sugar and there's no stopping mechanism.
There's no satiation mechanism, yeah.
But with meat, there is satiation, and there's a certain point that you won't be able to eat past it. And when you let yourself learn that these are actually safe foods, then that voice can start to quiet down.
I guess it depends on your side dishes.
You have to be in an immersion recovery
Good point, Carl.
program. Yeah. This is just missed in the discourse.
There's a psychological aspect and there's a metabolic aspect. What I hear Amber saying,
and there's a neurological aspect.
Well, I would couple that with the metabolic, or it could be the middle of the Venn diagram, you could say. But what I hear Amber saying, and Amber, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that eating a species-appropriate whole foods diet, including maybe a lot of animal proteins and fatty meats, it addresses the metabolic aspect. Now, somebody can still have a psychological problem that requires some counseling. But my perspective is that, you do kind of need those things paired, and they're synergistic. So if somebody has a psychological issue with a metabolic underpinning, because mental illnesses are a form of metabolic disorder in some capacity, it serves to have a diet that can support the psychological intervention if that's required. And what I hear Joan saying is that sometimes there is that, we can call it psychological, and that can be intertwined with neurochemical approach that is also required as part of treatment. Is that a fair middle ground to put out there?
I would add a short correction there. So what I'm basing my ideas on is from watching the carnivore community for a long time, where a lot of people, recent years, it's drawn the attention of a lot of fit, healthy bodybuilder type people. But in the longer history of it, most of the people who were drawn to a carnivore diet were predominantly women who had health issues and weight issues, and a lot of them had a long history of battling their feeling that they needed to restrict food. And so when they came to the carnivore diet, and the people who were instructing them there are telling them, eat as much as you want, this can take some people a long time to really let go, because part of them is always saying, no, if you do that, you're going to gain weight. And for the majority of people, that's not actually what happens, but it takes time for that kind of habitual fear to ease off by actually testing and seeing the result.
Well, the key word that you used is community. So they're in a community where people are eating reasonable amounts or healthy amounts of fat and animal protein. So
well, they're not just eating healthy amounts. They're actually instructed to eat as much as you want. Like, get yourself as full as possible.
But what's happening is their mirror neurons are watching other people who are not binging on it and have control. There's the way around an addiction is to activate the mirror neuron system in the brain and not rely on the frontal lobe, which is typically compromised in an addiction. So if you're in a community, and this is what this is what we provide as a community so that you can get mirror neuron engagement instead of trying to figure it out and use a braking system, the frontal lobe, that's not working. So I can see how that would happen.
I might have a
carnivore.
misunderstanding.
Yeah, I also
Can you explain to me?
I'm supporting you, Amber. I do know at least one individual who had anorexia, BMI below 11, who went carnivore a while back without a community and is quite a healthy weight carnivore now.
The question that it brings to my mind is, maybe I'm not understanding what Joan's criteria are for addiction, because we might be talking past each other in terms of what qualifies as an addiction and how you know. Could you talk about that a bit?
We adapted the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual criteria developed by the American Psychiatric Association. We've adapted the criteria for diagnosing alcoholism. There are 11 behaviors that exist in a...
Is there a neurochemical part of the requirement in that? Uh-oh, maybe you've frozen.
And then there were two.
Oh, no.
And it's down to us, Nick.
All right, what are we going to talk about?
We're going to battle it out.
Candy's question? Candy's question, Nick?
Oh, there's a new question.
Oh, what is the question? Is ApoB a better test than LDL? Yes.
Yeah, for atherosclerosis.
Yeah. So ApoB, at least ApoB 100 is the lipoprotein that's on all VLDL, LDL, LPA particles, and it is a much better test than just total LDL-C, which is actually calculated. It's not usually even directly measured. And so the particle number, I don't even think that's a perfect test, but it's definitely a much better test, and ApoB is similar to particle number for cardiovascular risk. The answer I think this one I can move on is yes.
The interesting thing there is she took a calcium scan and got a 0 score, and her doctor ordered ApoB.
Yeah, well, first question that I would have is, if you got that calcium score, did he get it after you started a ketogenic diet, and how long after? Because it's not like you go on a carnivore ketogenic diet, your LDL goes up, and even if there would be a phenomenon on your CAC, it wouldn't change that fast. Conversely, if you start a diet and your LDL goes through the roof, and you get, a CAC a month or two later, and it's really high, that was not the diet. That has to do with your lifetime risk. So it's all about the timing of that score. And I think that physician's probably wanting to do just some more advanced testing beyond the standards of the panel to assess what they think your lifetime risk will be. I wouldn't say that you gotta, I would say what they did is reasonable in my estimation as a next step.
Nick, did you say you think it's reasonable to order ApoB even with a 0 CAC?
Yeah, well, I qualified it by saying it depends on when that CAC was ordered. But I don't think it's harmful. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's harmful to have those data, especially as a baseline measure.
Sure. I guess if there's a kind of underlying question is it that the doctor is skeptical that the CAC could really be indicative and they're looking to find something more?
They can do a CTA if they want. They can track it over time.
Thought process. Tracking over time is a good idea.
Having an ApoB does not mean that they're going to immediately prescribe a statin if it's high. I'm thinking I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's collecting data. I like more data. I want to know my ApoB, my LDLP, my small dense LDA, my CAC, my CTA, whatever. It doesn't hurt to have information.
Sure, yeah. Especially because then you can use it to find out what's happening over time, like you said.
Exactly.
I'm being texted by none other than Dave Feldman, who thinks this is a great conversation and wants in. So he's going to take George's seat in just a few minutes, and that ought to be really fun.
We were literally, I was saying I had to get off of the call with him to get on this call. So I'm excited to come back. We were talking with Tro about a case series in LMHR. Well, I think I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, we'll continue this. I'm sure you'll have very measured comments. Hey, Jones.
How much time do we have left?
You guys can literally take however long you need. It's just a stream. So after the Q&A, the rest of it will start up.
Cool.
Yeah, so we don't have a hard... This is the great thing about internet stuff, right? It just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. What's time?
Right. Yeah.
Candy said that the doctor's skeptical because she's a T1 diabetic with LDL of 77. Skeptical of what, Candy?
Her LDL 77. What?
Yeah, what's to be skeptical about there?
Your Applebee's going to be
I'm
low if your
skeptical
LDL
now.
77. Now I'm confused. I'm actually now I'm more confused why they're going ahead with the Apple. I mean, well, for some reasons, but if your CAC is 0 and your LDL 77,
you're in good shape.
Being a dead horse over there.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what your HDL and your triglycerides are with your XY.
True.
It's a lot of things.
LDL wise,
I wouldn't say most people would say so.
Yeah.
Do you feel great?
That's a good question. No, of course we can't give personalized medical advice here, but yeah, I was expecting when you ordered that your LDL was high. That is not high.
And calcium score 0. It's pretty good.
He wants it under 70.
So,
I assume that will be the reply. I'm not even going to reply to that though. That is there are some like algorithmic cut points that people like to put forth, like LDL above 190, you automatically go on a statin, no questions asked. And another cut point 4, I think type 1 diabetics is LDL below 70. I don't know what to say.
Amber, what did you have for dinner last night?
Can you guess?
Let's see. Was it a vegan vegetable salad with farro, quinoa? No, I don't know.
No,
I bet it was meat.
I had it was very simple. I had a burger, it was ground beef. I made it really thick because I like them to be fairly rare in the middle. And then I had sour cream with it.
Speaking about rare,
Go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, I think it should be a federal crime, to order an ahi tuna steak well done. My dad likes tuna well done. And it's like cuts like jelly, like ahi tuna. If I see someone order an ahi tuna steak well done at a restaurant, I just cringe. It's just like, it's just a crime to food nature.
Well done anything, but ahi is particularly heinous.
Particularly heinous, yeah. He won't watch this, so it's fine I said that.
So one of the things about Joan's story about her patient who found that she was addicted to fatty meat, my question is, what was she eating with the fatty meat? People don't usually eat it by itself without carbs. And, fatty meat and carbs is really, really delicious and addictive for a lot of people. So if she was having a sandwich, I can understand the cravings. If she was having a side of mac and cheese, I can understand the cravings.
It's two different addictive mechanisms. So carbs activate the dopamine and serotonin pathways. We've got good evidence for that. Fat activates a different pathway. It's the cannabis pathway. Like dairy has casomorphins that activates the opiate pathways. Excessive salt has shown to activate the opiate pathways. Caffeine activates the dopamine pathways. And then you have food additives, just the food scientists, the addiction scientists at the corporations have added to processed foods. So, really, it depends on the cueing more than the biochemistry. So if somebody, for example, if you grew up in a household that where the family had an ice cream business, then the fat, like dairy fat, would be able to perhaps activate a greater addictive response, greater loss of control, if that house was also traumatic. Like suppose there was abuse going on and the child learns to turn to cream for the numbing effect that cream will create in terms of activating the cannabis and the opiate systems. Whereas a child who grew up on a ranch, for example, might, in that same traumatic family of origin system, might turn towards the soothing effects of the fat in meats. And a third person who was just, oh, you're upset, here, have a cookie. That person's going to turn towards the sugary, the sugar. So it's like if you grow up in a smoking household, you're going to turn towards tobacco, but if you grow up in a drinking household, you're going to turn towards alcohol. There's a lot of Pavlovian conditioning of brain cells in the reward system that drives what the person is going to choose and how it's going to impact them.
It's interesting you said Pavlovian, because my understanding is that, oh, hey, Dave's here. My understanding is it's exactly like Pavlov's dog. So everybody knows, probably a lot of people, like, Pavlov's dogs, give them meat, they salivate.
That rings a bell.
Ring a bell, and then... Good one. And you ring a bell, and they'll salivate at the bell. My understanding is that neurochemical, what's going on with the VTA nucleus accumbens reward pathways that, with exposure to these hyperpalatable foods, with processed foods, there is a transference of the dopamine rush from when you consume the food to the expectation of it, which is really interesting because there's the segregation of the wanting and liking. The wanting and learning, and then the liking. So people think they like it, they conflate the two when they're not the same at all.
Yes, and they end up not wanting it, not liking it, but wanting it as the addiction progresses. So just like you can teach a salivary gland cell to react to a ringing of the bell, no food present, you can teach a reward brain cell to pump out craving neurotransmitters which can control behavior at a cue. So cueing cueing has been shown to precede loss of control over any substance. You also have another, you talk about what happened to the satiation mechanisms. You have instances of people who are eating non-processed foods that have been shown not to activate the addictive pathways, and they're overeating it, they're binging on it. Well, you know that if you stretch the stomach will release serotonin. It's another kind of addictive response to eating. But it is Pavlovian. We've got that good research. Pavlovian conditioning of reward cells is how the addiction gets established.
Do we actually know that and this might be an ignorant question, but people keep on saying, 90% of serotonin is made in the gut, but is there serotonin transcytosis to the brain?
Transcytosis.
Does the serotonin that is produced in the gut actually end up in the brain?
We do know. Yes.
No.
So the one study I'm going to cite, it was the study of gastric distension. So they artificially distended the stomach of a rat, and they did trance. They were able to track the serotonin to attaching to the serotonin receptors in the brain. And we also
they were
know
able
it
to show
because
that intestinally produced serotonin via tracer went into the brain.
So I'm going to say this just the way I understand it, that there was distension of the stomach, then the stomach released serotonin. It did travel to the brain. The other reason we know that there is attachment in the serotonin receptors is the evidence for downregulation. If you attach too often, the receptor on the cell is going to just literally crumple. It's a C-shaped receptor that crumples. That's the other piece of evidence we have that this serotonin is attaching there. This is work done by Judith Wertman.
I want to formally welcome Dave Feldman to the conversation.
Hi, Dave.
Dave, feel free to jump in, and we'll be going another hour, I'm sure.
I'm definitely a very distant second string to the seat I'm taking up with Georgia E. Believe me, I had probably 10 questions for her alone. So while she's not here, I'll do my best to try to sit in somewhat inadequately.
What's on your
I'm sure
mind?
you have somewhere you want to start. What you heard that you needed to chime in. When did you want to chime in before? Start there.
Actually, I came by invitation of Carl. We were chatting a little bit via text, and he said, well, since the seat's open, why don't you go ahead and jump on the panel? Certainly, I've had some opinions on some things that I teed up and sent to you guys, but I did find the discussion on appetite to be interesting. It's certainly something I've been kind of focusing on a personal level more recently, because it's also something my colleague Siobhan and I have talked about quite a bit, particularly with what constitutes satiety. And therefore, of course, how this plays into food addiction is something of enormous interest because, I think a lot of times it gets very, very oversimplified. I think everybody on this panel would agree with me on this, that oftentimes it's sort of talked about as I was hungry and therefore I ate, but I seem to have a problem keeping my appetite in check. And that's because, as it turns out, there's just so many different things, so many behaviors, so many triggers, all these different aspects to it. And the one thing that I can say that I can kind of contribute, even though I'm by no means an expert in this area, is, and Siobhan and I have talked about this quite a bit, doing experiments, doing N-of-1 experiments, where you are the catalyst for why your appetite would be the same, but the composition of your food is changing because of the experiment you're doing, allows you to kind of see this dose response, what your eating patterns and behavior, putting them into a kind of a structure that you understand in advance before doing it, I think can give you tremendous insight into those things that you're going to find out for yourself are triggers, are aspects of the way that you've been eating that you may not be aware of yourself. For example, I snacked more in the evenings than I realized I was doing. And this became more apparent the more I was doing experiments that had a very fixed eating window period. The same thing with the composition of my meals on a per meal basis. Once I had structure to when the meals were going to be eaten and exactly how much I was going to eat, it became a lot more obvious. And probably one of my most recent personal discoveries, I genuinely didn't think I could do longer intermittent fasts than, say, 10 to 12 hours. I felt like it was already kind of a push to get to the 14 hours that I advocate for, 12 to 14 hours for fasting blood tests. But that changed when I realized that actually I can, if I eat within about a 4 to 4.5 hour window early in the day, from like, say, 10 to 2 p.m. or 10 to 3 p.m., that it's possible, but that I had to eat enough calorie or just enough of what I was going to eat over the course of the day condensed into that period of time. And that only came from having divined an experiment around it. So that's just the one piece I wanted to add. For anybody who's watching this, who may not be able to parse out all the different science and so forth, and may not be able to be reading all the literature, at least always put on the table for yourself that experiments, you'd be surprised how much information you can find by just putting in a little effort in planning and executing experiments and having your eyes open through the period to understand that data for yourself. That's just Dave, all I wanted to add to that.
I can second that protocol that you did. I've been doing that as well, and it's being ketogenic since 2016. After a while, I plateaued off. After, during the apocalypse here, I definitely gained about 30 pounds.
Like everyone.
Like everyone else, yeah. And the only thing that works for me now is a window in the afternoon. And you're right. I put in a whole, I eat to satiety in a 4 or 5 hour window, and I have to stop by like 5, 6 o'clock at night. Otherwise, my sugar goes nuts. But I can keep it in control if I do that protocol. And I don't mean goes nuts. I just mean, everything works when I do that protocol.
That's great.
Dave, let me go back to how you started out the question, which is about cravings and hunger. And I think this is one of the reasons why food addiction is so much harder to put into remission than other addictions, because when tobacco came into processed foods and they hired the consultants to max out the sugar, fat, salt content, and then boom, obesity takes off. They were able to do something they had also done in cigarettes, which was to hide increased amount of nicotine in the cigarettes. So they extracted concentrated nicotine and then hid it in the cigarettes. You bought a loaf of bread in the 70s, it was, it was whatever it was. But by the 1990s, it was that same slice of bread, but with a lot of sugar, fat, salt hidden in it, and it became addictive. It crossed the line into being able to activate those reward pathways to the point where the addiction was controlling behavior. So one thing that makes this whole field very difficult is the fact that these particular drugs are being marketed as food. So they tried, saying, oh, cigarette smoke doesn't hurt you. But nobody ever lost sight of the fact that there was smoke in the air that they were inhaling. But we have lost sight of the fact that there is sugar, fat, salt, major quantities of it, addictive quantities of it, hidden in our food. So the first thing to do is make a distinction between the drugs that are being sold to us as if they were food and real food. And once you get those two, like you can say, okay, I'm going to have a real food, I'm going to have a real food day. I'm going to have 4 of those in a row. You get through withdrawal from the food like drugs. The cravings stop. You order your meals and you find that you're only hungry, only thinking about food when your body's expecting a meal. And that is the breakthrough there. People think that they're hungry, but it's not. It's a drug craving.
I want to talk about satiety too, because I think people mean a lot of different things when they're saying that they've eaten to satiety. There was something that I didn't actually experience until I went on a carnivore diet, and I still don't get it with every meal. But you would think, being several decades old, I would know what it means to feel full. But I've come to find that like fullness, actual like the sensation of your stomach being not empty, has nothing to do with the thing that I'm going to describe. I have had this experience where I'm eating meat, and I was brought up to be a finish your plate kind of person, and I will always tend toward doing that. But if I am eating very fatty meat, I will get to a point, it could be in the middle of a bite or when my fork is being lifted to my mouth, that I will suddenly have this surge of a sensation of satiety. It's like I have had, I guess satiation is the more accurate word. I have had enough and I cannot possibly eat any more. And it doesn't have anything to do with room. It's just it's like this feeling coursing through my blood, and it's like a force field will appear in front of my face. Like there's no way that more of that could go into my body. And I had never experienced that before.
No, this is food-related satiation, and it is attainable, but you can't, unless you're in addiction recovery, you can't turn off an addiction. So it's the addiction that's preventing people from being satiated. They finish a meal, it's pizza, and they immediately start thinking about the next meal. That's an addiction.
Yes. I can remember, I didn't necessarily feel addicted, but I could remember previous to carnivore, not only thinking about my next meal after the one that I'm on, but while I'm eating the one that I'm on, I'm already thinking, what am I going to make next?
Yes, that's an addiction.
Can I tell you, I've long had this fantasy. In fact, I think I've talked to Carl about it, where it's basically like a keto fest island or whatever. It's basically, it's a resort It's far away. You could almost treat it like rehab. I mean, truly, where you have for 10 hours a day an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's extremely low carb, but it's not stocked with a lot of liquid and refined forms of fat. It's stocked with a whole bunch of real food, fatty meats, cheeses, salmon, all kinds of fish, things along those lines. Eat as much as you want within that span of time. And I genuinely believe that just having such a place that's like well outfitted, it's got high-speed internet, so people could work from it, so on and so forth, could really do wonders. But I think for many of us, certainly for a lot of members in my family who, have all of the trappings of the things we associate with addiction, the people, places, things, the things that we have as part of our daily routines that bring us back around to it. It kind of takes sort of getting physically out of that space and physically into a space in which you really can disconnect from a lot of those. I think it's not just a matter of what you can see that happens to you, but again, being kind of a data, fanatic as I am, I think it also helps when people see their own blood work coming back. Like if you get a snapshot of what it was before you go into such a program or a state and so forth, and then you see it afterwards, it's so meaningful for so many people. And I think part of the problem is that the propagation of the existing food industry that's all around us right now, it makes it tough because it's everywhere. There's much more. How often do you find the opposite of a food desert? If you find how often are you trapped between too many farmers markets on all sides, right? Where darn it, all I can get is fresh food, as far as the eye can see. No, it's the opposite. The vast majority of food that's within reach, within access to us, is probably food that is not going to be beneficial to our health and longevity.
This is deliberate. It's a business model. It's the addiction business model, the 5 A's, I call it. It's availability, affordability, advertising, young age of onset, and hiding addictive substances in the product. And you're talking about availability and advertising. But availability alone has been shown to be able to kick up the spillage of this excessive craving neurotransmitter, which can control behavior. We started to talk earlier about stages of dopamine rushes, and we do have evidence that the highest dopamine level is in the seeking phase. So sometimes people will say, well, once I bought it, I could throw it away. I didn't eat it. But this is where loss of control starts. It's in the seeking phase. So in your utopia, Dave, which I agree, I've made that utopia inside my house. Like my house doesn't have any availability of addictive substances. And my brain doesn't expect to see it. So the cravings aren't activated in my house. Get out on the street and you're passing one processed food outlet after another. And my brain turns on and says, oh, it's available. We could go get it. But there's another thing you can do about it, which is you can train the brain to go down a different path. So all of our brains are trained by the food industry when we see these substances to say, oh, yummy, everybody's eating them. Not in this room. But what you can do is using that Pavlovian conditioning, you can train that brain to think, oh, that is going to make me so sick. It's cue neutralization, and you have to do a lot of it. Yeah.
I don't know if you saw me smiling a lot as you were saying that, because you described something that I very much appreciate, and have experienced, because when you were saying that, I was thinking about being back in Oxford, after I had just been on a ketogenic diet for my colitis. So I used to just eat tons of sugar. I developed terrible colitis and I recovered from it on a ketogenic diet.
I'm so sorry.
But I always loved to go through the covered market and walk through like the really nice dessert stations. And I was always a foodie, and I still like to go seek, right, and look at all these truffles, and it brought me pleasure. But it was weird because I was looking at them and I'm like, I love looking at this and the artistry, but I actually don't want it. Like, I don't have a craving, yet I'm still brought pleasure by looking at it.
It'll still give you that dopamine high just by looking.
It was a forced repriming because I knew I have no desire to go back to where I was. I had no craving for it. taste preferences whatsoever. I didn't even really have a sweet tooth.
Yeah.
But there was still this is beautiful. This is like, I had like these cultural associations to it, and it brought me pleasure.
Yeah,
in a
absolutely.
Weird other way.
And they're beautiful
in
England.
It was.
But this is what Dave was saying. This is what Dave was saying. He's saying, if you can give them their blood work, what you're doing in that moment is you are reprogramming the brain to go from, wow, that looks yummy, to, wow, that's going to mess up my blood work. That's Pavlovian conditioning.
Give them a CGM.
Yes, that was my next topic.
Oh, oh no.
Hello, Twitter.
That is definitely Pavlovian conditioning. You know, you touch the stove and it's hot a few times.
Real quick for the viewer, if you're watching this months from now, you probably didn't know this, but there was a week on Twitter like no other week where the subject of CGMs come in. I'm not going to mention the exact origin story. I'm just going to say it's been a loud week. There's some very strong opinions on CGMs. I'm sure all of us on this panel have strong opinions, but
well, look at the time.
It's been impressively played out. I honestly cannot. I don't know about you guys. I've been on Twitter 4 years, 5 years. If I were to rank in a top 5 of weeks for which there was something really dominating nutrition Twitter, this definitely hits that list, if not in the top 3.
What were the arguments? What were the arguments?
The idea is that people shouldn't have access to CGMs because it's causing them to worry about things. Yes, because it's causing them to worry about things that aren't real problems.
Well, phones are like that, though, too. I mean, social media is an addiction, isn't it? I mean, I'd rather use my phone to tell me what my blood sugar is than, how many likes I got on my Facebook post.
That's true. I spend way too much time on Twitter.
It's negative reinforcement for
underutilized data.
Glucose.
I wish we had. I wish we had huge amounts of non-diabetic CGM data constantly being studied by scientists, and for that matter, I do think that, look, no question, as with all data, especially that comes medically, that blood work, etc., the same could be said for existing glucometers, right? You could go get an over-the-counter glucometer right now, check your blood, and you could have a reaction to whatever that number is, and if you're not familiar with what it means, it could be the wrong reaction that you have, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. That said, I have to say some of the most meaningful data I have ever gotten has been from having a CGM attached. It's been very meaningful to me to see what patterns arise based on the things that I eat. And I understand what a lot of the criticism has been, which is that there's a concern. Some people are going to put on a CGM. They're going to find that having a carbohydrate-rich meal results in a spike in glucose, and then from that, assume that all glucose or all carbohydrates are bad because if glucose goes up, that's always bad. And I think almost nobody is making that case in the low-carb community. I think many of us would state that it's about the dysregulation. Diabetes is itself about dysregulation. I know plenty of people are on a very high-carb diet and are thriving and doing well, and their blood work looks great. And they have low-fasting insulin. But if you see on a CGM your glucose is going all over the place, and, for example, you thought you weren't diabetic, well, that's going to help you at least find out to some degree that may be on the way or that you're already there. It's quite possible. I think there's a problem with looking at just annual blood tests, looking one time per year at your fasting glucose, especially if these patterns could say more. So I, for one, definitely think CGM data for presumable non-diabetics could turn out to be useful with all the necessary caveats that, yes, you should better understand how you should work with your doctor. You should talk with other experts about what that data means. But all that said, I think we'll look back on this week in 5 years from now with a very new understanding of how we feel about getting continuous glucose monitoring from hopefully non-invasive wearables in the future.
I really
Let
hate
me
to
take
do
the
this
opportunity to applaud
wait.
you.
I really hate to do this to you guys, but we're running out of time. We've been an hour and a half.
No!
And I'm going to have to ask you to make a closing statement, starting with Nick, and then we'll get back to the program.
All right. My closing statement is going to be one of optimism for the future. And that is that I think that there are a lot more people in what I would call the conventional medicine community that are really interested in what we're talking about and a lot more open-minded to it than people think. And the more I talk to people at these deemed to be conventionally minded institutions, the more I'm impressed by their depth of thought and consideration when approached appropriately. And maybe I'm just too much of an optimist, but I do have the sense that we're kind of hitting an inflection point where the voices are loud enough and there's, becoming a lot more data that this is going to take off, and we won't have to go for that much longer through the motif and the pattern of person gets sick, person struggles with a conventional healthcare system, person tries something different, and then person becomes a low carb or whatever evangelical, and then that grows and grows and grows just through that pattern. I think that the data are starting to speak a little bit louder, and I do really think that people are listening, even though that there's a lot of polarization on Twitter. That'll be my closing statement.
Mr. Feldman.
Well, of course, I wasn't even thinking I'd be on this panel, but I loved the discussion that was going on, and I share Nick's optimism. Obviously, if you follow my work, if you follow me on social media, I advocate for that exact same thing. And just to amend to it further, great speakers like David Unwin, like Ted Naiman, they all have a story of pivotal patients that brought them good data, talked to them about it, brought a reasonable case, and really changed their minds to a degree in which they feel very differently. So I can't advocate more. Let's keep it nice, keep it productive.
Iron Chef Ahern.
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to actually toot my own horn a little bit and say that if you haven't had a chance to watch my talk yet and you're interested in the connections between energy and sleep, you might find it interesting. I'm also going to continue and dive deeper into those topics at the Ancestral Health Symposium this year.
All right. And Joan?
I want to talk about frustration, the bottom line. Practitioners are frustrated because they tell patients and clients what to do, and the patients and clients don't do it. And then frustration on the part of the individuals. I know what to do, and I cannot do it. So just know that there is a hidden mechanism. It's being, spread by the same corporations that got 2/3 of Americans to smoke. It's a hidden addiction, and there is hope. I like this discussion of optimism. My optimism comes from being able to treat. We now have treatment methods, the recovery methods, peer support methods for treating this. I think it's fair to say this is the most severe addiction ever, because it starts with very small children. So yes, have hope.
Wow. Yeah, my optimism is in a pot of hot water, 134 degrees, sous vide, and it's a Wagyu New York strip, which I'm going to go partake of shortly. So thank you all for making this Q&A fantastic, and we'll get back to the program now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks.